Hello again. This 70th week of Daniel is so important, and we've looked at what Daniel chapter 9 told us about it, and now we are going to look at some of the other sections from other places in the Bible that cover this. How do we really know that this 70th week prophecy is talking about a future 7-year period? What is the abomination of desolation? And what is the significance of the second half of this 70th week? So we'll go back to our familiar chart here and remind ourselves that at the beginning of the week, Antichrist makes a covenant, and that's what starts the 70th week. I believe this verse in Daniel chapter 9 is the only place that tells us exactly what begins the 70th week. So that's all we know, is that the Antichrist makes a covenant. It will be a covenant with Israel that they think will assure them peace. So in our world today, we can certainly imagine some great leader coming along and being able to finally get a Middle East peace deal done with Israel and the Arab world. Now, in the middle of the week is the abomination of desolation. And Daniel has told us that that's the middle of the week. And there are a number of places that refer to this abomination of desolation. And then there's quite a bit that the Bible tells us about the second 3.5 years beyond the abomination of desolation. So go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, and here is another prophecy about the abomination of desolation. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. And from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, shall be 1,290 days. We'll get more into the arithmetic in a moment, but 3.5 years is actually 1,260 days. And the reason this says 1,290 days is because of something that happens in that extra 30 days afterwards that we'll cover at some future time. Now we're going to Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, to what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse. The reason people call this the Olivet Discourse is he was standing on the Mount of Olives, looking back at the Temple Mount and Jerusalem, and telling his disciples what would be the signs of his coming and of the end of the age. So in Matthew 24, we'll read verses 15 and 16. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, we do understand that in the middle of the week, the Antichrist sets up the abomination of desolation. This is what Daniel had foretold. Jesus tells us point blank that he's referring back to Daniel. So we've read these scriptures to know that there's something where the daily sacrifice is taken away and some kind of terrible abomination goes on in the temple. Now, what does it say that the people are? Who are the people that Jesus tells to do something? He says, those in Judea. That's who flees. Where do they flee? They flee to the mountains. Let's remember that. We'll come back to that point. Now we'll go to almost the identical saying in Mark, as the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, is recording also the Olivet Discourse. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Who flees? Those who are in Judea. Where do they flee? To the mountains. And of course, it's the abomination of desolation, the same thing at the midpoint. Now we'll look at what the Apostle Paul said about it in his epistle to the Thessalonians. So go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where we'll read the first 4 verses. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him. So I use the term gathering together and the rapture. I use them both. Many people use the term rapture. I would say the majority of people do, to refer to this event. Actually, the Bible doesn't use the word rapture. It refers to it as the gathering together, the episynagogo of the church. But we'll come back to that later. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come until the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So if that isn't the abomination of desolation, what is? Here we have the man of sin, the Antichrist, coming and showing himself in the temple that he is God. So this ties into that midpoint. We know that this is happening in the midpoint of the 70th week. We know that those sayings of Jesus that we read in the Olivet Discourse are happening in the middle of the 70th week. And so also notice the words, the falling away comes first, that the man of sin is revealed. This is what will indisputably reveal him. This is when he comes out of the closet at the abomination of desolation in the midpoint of the 70th week. And that's why it's so important. We don't know everything that's going to occur during the first 3.5 years, and how well recognized it will be that the Antichrist is the Antichrist. But when he stands in the temple of God, demanding worship, declaring that he is God, everyone with eyes to see and ears to hear will realize that that's the revealing of the man of sin. Okay, so we've looked at the midpoint, and now let's go to some of the scriptures that tell us very specifically that how important the second 3.5 years are, and some of the things that happen. And by extension, if we go back, if this is the second 3.5 years after the Antichrist has committed the abomination of desolation and revealed himself, then we know that the 7-year period is an actual 7 lunar years, and it's an actual 7-year period sometime in the future. It's often called the tribulation in conversations about the end times, The Bible doesn't actually refer to it as the tribulation, as we'll see when we break it down a little further. But that's what people mean when they talk about the tribulation. So here we are back in Daniel chapter 12, and we'll be reading verse 6 and 7. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, this is an angel who was revealing all of this to Daniel, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So this is a hard saying. This time, times, and half a time doesn't really mean anything in our language today. But we'll see from other scriptures that it lines up perfectly with this last 3.5 year period and 1,260 days or 42 months. So what it's saying, a time would be a year. Times would be 2 years, and half a time would be half a year. So a 1 plus 2 plus a half makes the 3.5 years. Okay, so right here also in Daniel chapter 12, if we keep reading, it again will define itself. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. So we 3.5 years on a lunar calendar is 1,260 days, and then there's actually another interval of 30 days after that that totals up to 1,290, and then after that is another 45-day interval, which is a cleansing, a restoration period of some kind that brings it up to 1,335 days. So here, Daniel 12 has in essence told us that during that last 3.5 year period, time times half a time, it equals 1,260 days, and it's a period of time when Israel will be totally destroyed, and then at the end of it will be saved and redeemed and rescued. Okay, so now the book of Revelation will pick up very similar language, obviously referring back to Daniel and giving us more information on what happens here. And so we'll go to Revelation chapter 12 and read the first 6 verses. And this is referring to something that happens in the second 3.5 years. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. And she, being with child, she cried out in labor and in great pain to give birth. So this is obviously symbolic, and as we look at it, we think, what could this be talking about? But what we try to do here is to find the things that are easy to understand and build a foundation of the things we can understand. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Well, now, when we see that, that's something we know about. We know that Messiah will rule all the nations. We know that there are 12 tribes of Israel. So it seems pretty safe to conclude that this woman with the garland of 12 stars having a male child, this is a symbolic um, shortening of the story that Israel, the woman Israel, is going to give birth to the Messiah, and we have a pretty good guess as to who this dragon is who's waiting to devour him as soon as he's born. Going back, she bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Well, that happened at the ascension, right? After Jesus Christ died and was resurrected, he ascended up to heaven and sat at the right hand of God. So the woman here symbolically is a representation of Israel. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, and that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Uh, so now remember Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, who was supposed to flee? Those in Judea. Where are they supposed to flee? To the mountains, which is also wilderness in that area. So we're really talking about the same thing, that at the midpoint of the tribulation, when the Antichrist is revealed, those who are in Judea are to flee. And here we're told in this last few lines that the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. So God is going to protect that portion of Israel that is obedient, those who are in Judea who flee into the wilderness. Okay, let's go to Revelation chapter 12. And now we're going to read verses 13 and 14. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Well, we know that the male child is Jesus, and we've concluded that the woman who gave birth symbolizes Israel. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to the place to her place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Well, again, this is all tying it together and giving us greater and greater certainty that we understand at least a few things that are going on here. The serpent, we know who the serpent is. Satan, he's called that all the way back in the garden. And here it again uses that hard phrase of a time, times, and half a time. Now, right up before this, we had read that that was 1,260 days, and now it's a time, times, and half a time. So we're becoming more and more sure that this second half of the final 7-year period is this 3.5-year period that these prophecies are talking about. Now we'll back up to Revelation chapter 11 and read the first 3 verses. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months." So we've had the saying, a time, times, half a time. We've had 1,260 days, and now we have 42 months. The arithmetic is the same for all 3. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So even though we don't understand everything here, we understand that there's this important period of 42 months that those who are in Judea are to flee to the mountains into the wilderness, and God will protect them. And meanwhile, the Antichrist, under the direction of the serpent, Satan, will have trodden underfoot the city of Jerusalem. Now we'll go to Revelation chapter 13 and read verses 4 and 5. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. We know this to be the devil, Satan. We're told that in other places. So they worshiped the dragon and gave authority to the beast. The beast is the Antichrist. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemy, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. So among these scriptures that we've looked up, we see that the time times half a time equals 3.5 years. So does 1260 days in a lunar calendar. So does 42 months in a lunar calendar. So that's the second half of the 7-year period. Now let's look briefly at what happens at the end of the 7-year period. And this is in Revelation chapter 19. We'll be reading verse 11 and then 19 through 21. So verse 11, "Now I saw the heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war." Obviously, that's the returning Lord Jesus Christ. "And I saw the beast, who we've determined is the Antichrist, and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. And these two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh." Now we see from this last chart that at the end of this second 3.5 year period, the second half of the 70th week, that the Antichrist is completely taken out. He's destroyed. He's cast into the lake of fire, and the host arriving with Jesus Christ at the Battle of Armageddon is completely triumphant. And then they will begin doing the things that will establish his 1,000-year kingdom on earth for the next 30-day period and the next 45-day period that comes after the 1,260 days. So now we have a framework where we can feel like that we're sure that the 70th week refers to a future 7-year period. We know that in the middle of the week, Antichrist is revealed, as it said in 2 Thessalonians, when he goes into the temple of God, declaring that he is God. That's equal to the abomination of desolation. And then he wreaks terrible destruction on Israel and tramples Israel, but God protects those in Judea who are obedient and flee into the wilderness, into the mountain. God protects a remnant of Israel, and then Jesus Christ comes back and destroys the beast and the false prophet in the Battle of Armageddon.